How much should you be saving for retirement right now? And what should your asset allocation be? How much should you have invested in equities versus bonds? And what two things can you do to make your retirement savings last a little longer? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 5th episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Hey everybody, whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Today we've got a guest that I'm excited about. His name is John Sweeney. He works with Fidelity, and Fidelity has recently come out with a study and additional information on basically how to improve your retirement preparedness. They've come out with what they call 6 accelerators, or 6 things to do to help your retirement savings. 3 that you can do before you retire, and 3 things you can do after you retire. And so I asked John if he'd come on the show and share this information with us, and he agreed to. And so I've got an interview with John that I'll play in just a minute. This is an important topic. I get a lot of questions from readers about how to figure out whether you're on the right track. How much should you be saving out of your paycheck? How should you invest for retirement? You know, what's the magic number? I'm a big believer that there is no real magic number that you need to retire. I think it's fine to have a goal. If you listen to our previous podcast with Rick Ferry, an investing author and money manager, he said that his number is $2 million. That's what he wants to retire. I don't have a number yet. Maybe I'm a bit too young for that. I'm not quite 50, so maybe I'm not close enough to retirement. I certainly have savings goals and investing goals. But in any event, folks like John from Fidelity try to simplify this for us, and that's always helpful. And while they don't break it down, at least in our interview today, into specific, you've got to have X percent or X times your ending salary or things quite that concrete, he does provide some pretty good, I think, tips on what you can do right now, very practical, down to earth. What can you do right now to help better prepare yourself for retirement? It's not an easy thing. It's one thing to say, well, save whatever, 15% of your income. But I know for a lot of people, that's very difficult to do. I mean, saving anything or 5% is hard to do, let alone 10 or 15% or more. And then you've always got the whole business about, what do you do with it? Even if you have a 401k, where do you invest it? How do you figure all that out? Now, we answered a lot of those questions, or certainly gave you a lot to think about with the interview with Rick Ferry. John from Fidelity, I think, has very consistent views on investing, but it's coming at it from a different angle. And that's why I'm excited about today's interview. I'm hopeful that it brings you a lot of practical tips, things that you can take away, changes perhaps that you can make in your retirement savings today. This is not a lot of theory. This is sort of very practical stuff. And so what you're going to hear, John and I are going to walk through these 6 accelerators that Fidelity has just come out with. And just to kind of give you a roadmap of where we're going to go, the pre-retirement accelerators, the first one is raising how much you save. And I know that's, again, sometimes easier said than done, but he's going to talk about sort of specific goals in terms of saving a certain percentage. So that's one. 2, he's going to talk about reviewing your asset mix. And there it's primarily about how much you invest in stocks versus bonds, or stock funds versus bond funds. And he'll talk about that. That's very important. A lot of folks today are kind of scared of the stock market. We tend to get scared of the stock market at the wrong time. We get scared, in the 2008, 2009 time period when the stock market dropped significantly. And then now fast forward to 2013 when it's been up, people seem to lose their fear and start investing in the stock market when it's high rather than when it's low. And so one way to deal with that is just to keep a consistent asset allocation or mix of assets, regardless of whether the market's up or down. In any event, you'll hear John talk about asset mix. And the third pre-retirement accelerator we're going to talk about today is one that, may or may not appeal to you, but it's an important thing to consider, and that is retire later. Putting off retirement from, say, 65 to 70 can have a big impact on your retirement savings and your income and lifestyle in retirement, and John will talk about that. Those are the three pre-retirement accelerators. He'll also talk about 3 accelerators once you've already retired. And one, not unlike retire later, is return to work part-time. That's actually something that appeals to me. Even though I'm some years away, I do plan to work and have various, whether it's my own business or what have you, have the ability to earn some income in retirement. I don't see just quitting cold turkey at age 65 or whatever and having zero income. And but in any event, one accelerator once you're in retirement is to work part-time. John will talk about that. He'll also talk about how you can realize some capital from your home equity, and we'll look at actually a couple of ways to do that. And then the third thing John's going to talk about is allocating part of your savings to an annuity. And I know annuities are a fairly complex, complicated topic. There's a lot of different varieties, but John's going to tackle that tough issue as a way to perhaps give some stability and certainty to your retirement income. So that's where we're headed today with John, and hope it helps you. I think it's going to be some very practical, down-to-earth strategies that you can put into play today. And with that, let's turn it over to the interview. John, welcome to the show.
Rob, thanks for having me.
I appreciate your time here. John, you're with Fidelity, as I've told the listeners earlier in the show. Can you tell us what you do at Fidelity?
I'm Executive Vice President of Retirement and Investing Strategies. So we try and help investors understand how to prepare and plan for accumulation in retirement and then distributing their wealth as they enter into that phase of retirement distribution.
And can you just share a little bit of your background, your education, and how you came to work at Fidelity?
Sure. I've been at Fidelity for 15 years, had a variety of roles in product management and marketing, essentially sitting between the distribution and the asset management for most of that time period. Managed our mutual fund product line, our managed account business, our guidance and planning tools, and our trust bank.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time today and coming on the show. I know we're going to talk about something that Fidelity has just released called the Retirement Preparedness Measure, or RPM, which is of particular interest, I can tell you, to readers of my blog and listeners to this podcast. I get tons of questions along the lines of, how much do I need to retire? Am I saving enough for retirement? What should my asset allocation look like when I'm 57 after a divorce? I mean, the questions get very, very specific. And so I think this is a great time for this. So why don't we sort of jump right into the questions? And to start with, can you tell us what the Retirement Preparedness Measure is that Fidelity has released today?
Sure. The questions that your listeners and readers are asking you are the same questions that our representatives get every day. So millions of times a year, we go through some type of guidance interaction with our customers, and they're asking, depending on their stage of life or their retirement preparedness, exactly the questions your readers and listeners are asking you. How much do I need to stay in retirement? If I've accumulated this by this age, am I on track to retire successfully? And so what we do is we have a series of guidance tools that work at various stages of life, depending on the stage that you're in, to help you assess where you are, to help plan out where you should be, and to help you distribute your wealth when you reach that phase of life. And what we did in this survey, our retirement savings assessment, is essentially took 2,200 customers that we surveyed, asked them a series of very detailed questions about their saving and spending patterns, and then projected out when they reached retirement, how successful they might be if they entered into retirement at some point down in the future.
Okay, and how did you then accumulate all of these test results? In other words, was there results that showed some folks were on track to retire while perhaps others were not?
Absolutely. So what we looked at is when we aggregated the survey as a whole, we came out with a retirement preparedness measure of 74 for America. So what that means is that about half of America, 55% of the people, are not on track to replace their essential expenses. So that's a concern. And obviously there are a lot of data points in there. There are some people who are very well prepared at all age cohorts, but there are a lot of people who need to take some action steps to try and figure out how to catch up and get their path to a green level.
And in reaching that conclusion, was there some sort of rule of thumb that you used in terms of how much money folks needed to have at retirement for Fidelity to conclude that, yes, you're likely to be able to replace your essential expenses?
That's a great question, and actually it varies. So we looked at replacement rates, and what we mean by that is if your pre-retirement income was $100, how many cents on that dollar did you need to replace when you moved into retirement? There were three main factors that drove that replacement rate. One was income level, the second was activity level, and the third was your health status. So income level is actually the biggest driver, and I'll give you two bookend examples. Somebody making $20,000 a year will need almost all of that $20,000 post-retirement. They are living very close to the edge. They are spending almost every nickel they have on food, shelter, medical expenses, and so they don't have a lot of discretionary income. By contrast, somebody making $200,000 is presumably saving a lot, has a lot of discretionary income, and so the essential expenses as a percentage of that person's pre-retirement salary could be much lower. So that's the biggest driver. The activity level in retirement is also another big driver. Those who want a more active lifestyle and want to travel more will need more of their pre-retirement income when they retire in order to replace that lifestyle. And the third factor is obviously health. If you're in poor health, you're going to have higher healthcare expenses. So those three factors led us to a range of replacement rates that ranged essentially between 70 cents on the dollar and almost 100 cents on the dollar for those lower income folks.
Okay, and that's a good point that, this is, while we try to come up with rules of thumb and guidelines for folks, this sort of analysis is very much individual, and everyone's situation is a little different. And while you might start with a rule of thumb to begin with, you got to look at your specific situation to reach, conclusions.
That's absolutely right. So the retirement preparedness measure is essentially aggregating all of these guidance interactions in these plans and giving us a rule of thumb that we can start from. And we can say that young investors have this kind of preparedness score, older investors may have this kind of preparedness score, people of these different age, asset and income levels may have these different preparedness scores. What we hope to do is stimulate some action and have folks say, well, where am I and what activities can I possibly take? And that's what's really unique about this particular study is we've actually quantified the value of each of the action steps that people can take in order to improve their retirement preparedness measure.
Okay, and I want to turn to those action steps, but real quick before we do, so if I understand what you've said, the lowest percentage of income needed in retirement, at least that you all used in the study, was 70%.
That's essentially what we saw. I'll say that there's one other very big factor that's a contributor there, and it's the presence of a mortgage. So people who enter into retirement with several years left on their mortgage, they obviously have a higher hurdle to clear. If you've paid off your mortgage, or one of the action steps that people can take is reduce the size of their home, you've perhaps lowered the expense ratio that you have to clear if your mortgage is paid off, or you've moved to a less expensive dwelling that you can cover easily in your retirement years.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I'm not quite 50, almost. And our mortgage is something that my wife and I are trying to tackle, and hopefully we'll have that done before we retire. But that's just another example of something that's very specific to individuals. And as you've noted, some obviously have their mortgage paid off when they retire, and some don't. Okay, well, then let's turn to the factors, because I know that Fidelity today released sort of 6, I guess, pre-retirement accelerators, you call them, if I've got the lingo correct.
Correct.
And I'd like to kind of just go down one by one with you and look at each of them and talk about them. So I think the first one, at least in my notes, is to raise your savings rate now. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Very simply, we look at the savings rate of each of the different age cohorts, and we found that while there are many people who are saving in the recommended range of 10 to 15%, there are a lot of investors, and particularly younger investors, who are not saving enough. So these are younger investors who may have been defaulted into a savings rate of 3% in their 401k plan. And the highlight that we'd like to make them aware of is 3% isn't really enough. You have to increase your savings rate to get it to that 10 to 15% target range. That can include your employer contributions if you have a match in your 401k. But what people should be thinking about, particularly if they're young investors, is every year when you get a raise, think about banking that raise and putting that raise into your 401k.
And I take it the 10 to 15% savings rate is something that you think applies to folks that are in their 20s just starting off in their career.
Well, it's actually a target rate that we would suggest for anybody. So if there's a baby boomer who can save 10 to 15%, that's obviously a significant percentage of savings that we think is a meaningful number. People who are post-55 have some catch-up provisions where they can contribute extra amounts to their IRA. We would ask people to take advantage of those levels as well. But it's a target range that we ask folks to think about. Clearly saying 3% probably isn't enough to get you there. 25, 40% might be just untenable from a cash flow and a living standard.
Okay, and I noticed that if for folks that can increase their savings to 10 to 15%, Fidelity estimates that it will increase their RPM score, if you will, by 11%, from 74 to 82.
Correct.
Now, I take it, though, that's going to vary significantly depending on someone's age. So, in other words, if someone is 60 and they increase their savings rate, while certainly a good thing, I mean, they don't have as many years to work with that increased savings as someone who's 20. So how did you factor that into the study?
That's exactly right. So actually what we did is we took these 2,200 respondents and said, if we take your savings rate from whatever it is, and somebody may have been at 3, they may have been at 10, they may have been at 11, and moved it up to 15, what would the increase in the aggregate population have been? And that's where you saw that 11% differential. So it's taking each individual and improving them to the target range, and then recalculating the score and seeing what the average lift is across the board.
Okay, well, how about for listeners who say that's helpful at a sort of a high level, but what about my specific set of circumstances? Does Fidelity have tools or calculators or resources available? I'm happy to include links in the show notes to these items that people can use to figure out how, say, increasing their savings rate would help their specific circumstance.
Absolutely. We have a tool for people who are in accumulation mode called Retirement Quick Check. And it's a series of questions that you can go through and say, how on track am I to get to some replacement rate that is going to be meaningful for me in my phase of retirement? For folks who are closer to retirement, there are other tools that are much more around the budgeting and the essential expenses that you need in retirement. So it's hard when you're 25 to know what your living expenses are going to be 40 years in the future. But if you're within 5 years of retirement, you want to get pretty close. And we have 2 levels of what we call retirement income planning. One is a simple rule of thumb. Give me 85 cents on the dollar of what I make, and let's start with that as a metric. Or I can go through a detailed budget worksheet showing when I pay off my mortgage, what my real estate taxes are, when I may get an inheritance from an uncle who passes on in the future. You can factor in all these kinds of very detailed cash flows if indeed that's the level of planning that you want to go to.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I write a column for U.S. News and World Report every week on retirement. And, I'm certainly not an expert. I'm just someone who's given this a lot of thought and study, and it's obviously an important issue for our household. But in an article I published just maybe a week ago, it talked about how retirement planning really is different depending on your age. And retirement planning when you're 60 is going to look different than when you're 20. And to your point, for those starting out, my view was, try to save 15%. I mean, 10% is sort of a minimum in my mind. 15% is the sweet spot. And I think if you can possibly save 20%, you're hitting a home run. But, trying to calculate what your expenses will be in retirement when you're 25 is just, I'm not so sure that's very helpful. To your point, it's just so hard to do to predict 40 years from now what the world's going to look like, let alone your personal, finances. After our interview, can you send me links to those tools like the Retirement Quick Check and other resources that I can include in the show notes?
Absolutely.
That's great. And for those listening, the show notes this is episode 5. So as always, they'll be at DoughRoller.net/podcast 5, and I'll include those links that John sends to me. Okay, so raising the savings, how much you save, that's the first pre-retirement accelerator. The second one is review your asset mix. What does that mean? Right.
So what we found is that people were sometimes too conservatively invested. And in actuality, you end up getting some bookend behavior here as well. You have young investors who are afraid of getting equity exposure or stock market exposure. They say, well, the stock market's been volatile for the last 5 years. I want to wait for some period of stability. Well, clearly over the last 5 years, the market's been on a significant increase, and they may have missed out. What I would advise any young investor is you've got a long time horizon over which to accumulate wealth. You should be very aggressively invested in equities. And for a young investor as young as 25, we'd suggest almost 90% of your portfolio in equities. And just put it in a diversified portfolio and just keep rebalancing back into that if the market should get volatile over the next several years, which we should anticipate it will. But remember that you don't need this money for a long period of time. Conversely, even people who are approaching retirement sometimes get too conservative. And they say, oh, this is my nest egg. I'm 62, 63. I need to lock in whatever I have and put it in a series of CDs or government bonds and preserve the principal. That, too, is a dangerous outcome because a 65-year-old has to plan for living in retirement for 30 years. So one half of a couple has a 25% probability of living into their early 90s. And so when people think about how much equity exposure do I need, they often say a very low number. We would actually say to a 65-year-old, you probably need about half your portfolio in equities. So we're taking people who are too conservatively invested and moving them up to an age-appropriate equity allocation. But I will say on the flip side, we do see some 65-year-olds who are in 100% stocks. And so it's actually taking some of those people into a more conservative portfolio and saying you probably don't want 100% of your portfolio in equities. You probably want between 50 and 60%.
Yeah, that's a really good point, John. I was doing some research on the 4% withdrawal rate sort of rule of thumb, that you can withdraw 4% of your nest egg in year one of retirement and then adjust that amount each year by inflation. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Trinity study. It was one of the first done on this 4% rule by some professors at Trinity University. But one of the things that they did in their back testing, and one of the conclusions they reached, is that even in retirement, you need at least 50% equities in your portfolio in order for the 4% rule to work, meaning that you have a decent chance of your money outlasting you.
Yes.
And so, yeah, you can't, while you certainly can get more conservative over time, I guess what Fidelity has found is you can't get too conservative or you run into trouble.
Right.
Okay.
The 4% rule is interesting. When you think about it, a simple way to think about it is, if you remember your high school algebra, it's 1 over n. It's 1 over the time period that you have remaining. The problem is we don't know how long we're going to live. And we don't know what the market performance is. So if I told you that you had a 2-year time frame, I would pay you half of your portfolio in the first year and the second half in the second year. The 4% essentially comes from a 1 over 25, essentially a 4% withdrawal rate over a 25-year period. But to your point, it increases as the customer approaches longevity or approaches life expectancy. And the hope is that you get some market appreciation for those investors who live beyond life expectancy or beyond the 25-year time horizon. They assume that you hope that you've got some market appreciation that carries them beyond that point.
Right. Okay. Third pre-retirement accelerator factor is to retire later. And how does that help folks?
So time. You mentioned young investors have the benefit of time, and they certainly do. They have a longer time over which to accumulate wealth. Well, older investors actually have that same lever, but we all hope we can retire early. Maybe we'd like to retire at 65, but time is actually the biggest driver. If you can increase your retirement date from 65 to 70, for example, and continue to work, you've done two things. A, you've continued to earn for a period of 5 years, but B, you haven't drawn down your nest egg. So those two factors actually have a very significant 12% improvement in the RPM score.
Yeah, and I guess if you could hold off receiving Social Security benefits, too, you'd get a boost there.
That's exactly it. So each year you delay your Social Security benefit is about an 8% improvement in the annual percentage that you get paid. So you should think of Social Security essentially as an annuity. We're pooling our assets together with the other people in the country. Half of us will expire before life expectancy. Half of us will live beyond. We just don't know which half we're in. So the more you can defer your Social Security benefit and move that number out from 62 to 65 to 70, you increase the percentage you get paid, but it also creates a nice lifetime annuity income stream.
Right. Okay. The fourth factor, returning to work part-time, which I guess kind of seems obvious. You can earn some extra money during retirement. And it's actually something that I'm still a ways away from retirement, but it's something that I personally hope to be able to do. How did the study find that working part-time would affect folks, sort of the pre-retirement accelerators as you describe them?
There are a couple trends at work here. So today's retirees are saying, I don't want to just sit back on my porch and collect a check. I want to be actively engaged. I still feel healthy. With healthcare improvements, 65-year-olds are much more energetic and vibrant than they were perhaps in our parents' generation. So people want to work for the social reasons, but also for the economic reasons. So it may not be your primary career, but is there a secondary career that you can begin to develop and think about working part-time in retirement? It creates a nice income floor, and what it does is a twofold benefit. A, creates an income stream, but B, prevents you from tapping into your nest egg too early. So much like that retire later factor, it's something that people can do while they're entering retirement or in the early years of retirement. We suggest that they think about it before they plan to retire. it's hard once you're in retirement to then go back 5 years later and try and find a second career. So as you're planning that transition, if you can think forward and say, what would a secondary career be, or how could I think about working a few days a week at my current profession, that would be a great transition plan.
Okay, and great. Now, the last two factors are both of particular interest to me. And I'll start, of course, with factor 5 from Fidelity, and that is you can realize some home equity. You can use your house, which is for a lot of folks their single largest asset, to help them in retirement. How can they do that?
Right. So we talked about housing being one of the big expenses that each of us has. So mortgage lenders will often lend 30% of your income to satisfy a mortgage obligation. That includes your insurance, obviously, and your taxes. But when you think about what hurdle do I have to clear post-retirement, if you've paid off your mortgage, automatically your balance of your home or the income that you need to generate is much lower. One way to do that is to say if you've had a house that has a number of bedrooms, your children are grown and they're out of the house, do you really need to, A, pay for that kind of mortgage, and B, maintain that large home? So if you can downsize your home, we made some assumptions about a 25% reduction in the home equity costs of the investors who still had a mortgage obligation, and that made a significant improvement to their RPM score and boosted the score across the board of about 4%.
Yeah, I mean, one thing for me in that regard is that my wife and I live in Northern Virginia, which is one of the most expensive areas in the country. So while we don't have plans to move now, even though both of our children are grown and have moved out, we do sort of look down the road and think not only might we downsize, but we might move to a less expensive area of the country. But one question I have for you on this is, what is your thoughts on a reverse mortgage as a way to tap the equity in a home?
Right. Reverse mortgages are an industry that I think are developing. It's not yet fully developed. And there are a couple of things in the historical part of the reverse mortgage industry that have given it somewhat of a bad name. One, people would try and maximize the payment by making a reverse mortgage stream pay on a single life. We don't think that's a good idea. If one spouse expires before the other, the second spouse is obligated to pay off that loan, and they may want to remain in the home. So there were some practices, I think, in the reverse mortgage industry that are being addressed by some more reputable firms that are entering the business, and I think you're going to see that part of the market expand over time, but it's also saddled with some fairly high origination costs, as you would find in the primary mortgage origination business, that get deducted from the proceeds that the owners of the home receive. So it's a marketplace that I think will continue to develop over the next 10 years as people look to their homes as part of a retirement solution.
Yeah, and just for folks listening that may not be as familiar with reverse mortgages, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can have a reverse mortgage, as you mentioned, that's based on a single life. That is, if the husband and wife are living in the home, it can be based on, say, the husband's life. That would generate more income for the couple than if it was based on both of their lives. Am I correct about that?
That's correct, yeah. Yes. Because you're essentially like an annuity payment. If you pay on two lives, somebody's going to live longer than one person. So the mathematical probability of somebody surviving longer than the other person is quite high. But from a cash flow or recipient standpoint, you'd probably want to make that trade-off where you're insuring both lives and ensuring that both halves of the couple have some income streams.
Right. So it's a trade-off between how much money you'll receive each month from the reverse mortgage versus how long those payments will be made. And to your point, if you just insure one life, then you could leave the surviving spouse stuck financially.
Yes.
Okay.
Without an income stream and with an immediate obligation, too,
yeah,
to satisfy the mortgage.
And as you mentioned, and this is what I've read the same thing, that with reverse mortgages, you have to be careful of the significant fees that they can charge. That's just a question of a consumer doing their homework and their due diligence before entering into a reverse mortgage.
Right.
Okay, and then the last factor that Fidelity mentions is to reallocate a portion of savings to an annuity. So can you just give us an overview of how that would work and how you found it affecting folks' retirement plans?
Sure. So one of the risks that all of us have in retirement is longevity. So we don't know how long we're going to live. I mentioned the statistic before of one half of a couple having a 25% probability of living into their early 90s. So we want to try and box that risk as best we can. And so when you have the ability to annuitize a portion of your portfolio, you create an income stream for life. The psychological barrier that many retirees go through is they're giving their mortgage, their retirement part of their portfolio to an insurance company, in exchange for a stream of cash flows. So half of us will benefit from that annuitization because we'll live beyond life expectancy, but the other half of us who die before life expectancy will fund those who live longer. So the psychological barrier of giving up your money and putting yourself into a pool is a hurdle that some investors to try and get over. However, the benefits for people who have that income stream for life, those people feel very good about it because they've now outsourced the money management. They continue to collect a paycheck from the annuity provider. So there are some significant benefits to people who are inside the annuity once they've made that decision to purchase.
Okay.
Benefit from a retirement standpoint, if I may,
sure,
is that if you box the longevity risk and you have a steady stream of income that can help cover some of your essential expenses, you can be more aggressive on the rest of your portfolio because you have that steady stream of cash flow.
Okay, so I guess some of the advantages of an annuity, one is certainty of the payments until you pass away.
Yes.
And as you said, given that certainty, you can perhaps be a little more aggressive with the remainder of your portfolio. And by aggressive, I take it you mean investing more of it in equities versus fixed income.
That's correct.
And I take it some of the downsides are, one, as you said, you don't know when you're going to die, so you could end up giving away a big portion of your portfolio that had you known when you were going to die, you might have left to your children. But of course,
yes,
we generally don't know when we're going to die. So, I take it too, there are some like reverse mortgages. I assume there are fees involved with annuities. Is that right or no?
They are. There's an insurance fee. It is an insurance plan, essentially, that's run by an insurance company. So the annuities that we manufacture, Fidelity manufactures some variable income annuities, which mean you have the ups and downs of the stock or the bond market. So the payment streams are variable and related to the performance of the underlying investments. What we try and do is drive down what we call the mortality expenses that are a part of the management fees or the annuitization fees, drive those down as low as possible to make sure that they're low-cost annuities.
Well, for this study that you did you assume you mentioned variable annuity, but for this study, did you, what type of annuity did you use or assume for purposes of your study?
For this, we actually sell fixed income annuities from other providers, and we assumed a fixed income annuity in this particular situation with a cost of living increase. So obviously, if you're getting $1,000 a month when you retire at 65, that won't have the same purchasing power 20 or 30 years in the future. So having a cost of living adjustment included in the annuity payment stream is an important but expensive, what we call rider on top of the annuity. But we think it's important and would recommend that people think about the eroding power of inflation on their purchasing power of their dollar.
Again, that goes to the cost of living adjustment.
Absolutely. Yes.
I take it though, if you have a cost of living adjustment, I mean, there's always pros and cons, right? If you have a cost of living adjustment, the annuity, I assume, is going to pay out less the first month than if you didn't have that adjustment.
Actually, the cost of the annuity will be slightly higher because you're paying for an increased payment stream over time.
Okay, and does Fidelity have calculators that folks can use to get an idea of how much, say, if they had $1 million to just to pick a number, to put towards an annuity, what kind of monthly income that would generate?
We do. We actually have a program called Income Strategy Evaluator. And what it does is it takes your nest egg and allows you to model between various different investment products. So we wouldn't suggest that you put your whole portfolio in the annuity. That obviously doesn't create any, it gives us some liquidity, and we wouldn't recommend that somebody put their whole portfolio in an annuity. But how much could you put in an annuity to create an income stream that covers some of your essential expenses? And then how could you structure other payment streams, whether they're systematic withdrawals out of a portfolio of mutual funds, whether they're bond ladders that pay you interest income. You can model in different products that help create the cash flow, and you can see the variability of that cash flow in different market scenarios and try and make sure that you're covering your housing, your groceries, and your healthcare as essential expenses.
Okay, and is that income strategy evaluator available publicly even for folks that perhaps don't have an account with Fidelity?
It is. Our tools are available for people who want to come on the site and interact with them, so they're available to prospects as well as to customers. What we often find is that people test out a lot of the tools online at home. Maybe they're 55 and they're not yet ready to retire, but they want to see how on track they are. When they get a little bit closer, they call a rep, and when they get really close and they're about to, drop their resignation letter on their boss's desk, they come in and they sit down with a branch rep and say, this is the maximum amount of money I'm going to earn over my lifetime. I need to make sure I'm structuring it well before I go in and actually retire.
Okay, well, I'll be sure to include a link to that as well in the show notes so folks can use that tool if they'd like to. One last question, and I appreciate your time today, but one thing I've read is that with the interest rate environment today, with rates being so low, that the payout on annuities is not as rich as it used to be. Is that accurate? And if it is, should that influence folks' decision on whether to use an annuity as part of their retirement income?
Yep. So we certainly see the interest rate environment creating challenges for people no matter what vehicle they select, whether it's an annuity, whether it's buying a ladder of government bonds. None of them are paying particularly high interest rates. And when we step back and think about what the Federal Reserve is trying to do, is trying to keep interest rates low to stimulate the economy and to get job growth and to get companies to reinvest back in their businesses. So they're making a trade-off to grow the economy in that regard. So that's why we want to make sure that customers understand the role of equities in their portfolio. Equities have performed very smartly over the last 5 years as the government stimulus has helped to create a liquid and growing market for companies who have equity investments. And customers who have put a significant portion of their portfolio in equities have certainly benefited from that rising equity market.
Yeah, this is just a bit of commentary, I guess, from my perspective, but I'm generally concerned because I fear that the eventual rise in rates, which I think has to happen at some point, are both going to hurt equities, which, higher rates generally produce lower asset values. And they're also going to hurt existing bondholders. I mean, if you buy a new bond 10 years from now when the rates are, I don't know, let's say 8%, you're fine. But if you're holding bonds and other fixed incomes now, including buying an annuity today, you could end up getting hurt down the road. But that's, I guess, we all try to predict the future, and I've been wrong many times. But that's, I guess, my concern. But well, listen, John, I appreciate your time today. You've given us a lot to think about. If you can send me over links to these tools, I'd be happy to include them in the show notes for everybody so that folks can try out these calculators and tools at Fidelity to help plan their retirement. And appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I hope you found the interview with John helpful and that you can put into practice at least perhaps some of these accelerators that John talked about. I think one thing I would say just sort of as a takeaway is that particularly with retirement planning, there's no one right answer. There's no one right rule of thumb. Everyone's circumstances is different. And so I think these rules of thumb, or even in this case with John, Fidelity's accelerators, are really good starting points for further analysis. But you can't take these things at face value. You've got to look at your own individual circumstances to make sure that what you're doing, whether it's how much you're saving, how you're investing your savings, when you plan to retire, when you plan to start taking Social Security benefits, all of these sorts of questions are very individual, and you have to make sure that they're right for you and they're right for your family. And again, I think these accelerators from Fidelity are good starting points, but you have to take it from there to make sure what you're doing is right for you. The other thing I want to mention is I brought up reverse mortgages in this podcast. Fidelity, I don't believe, sells reverse mortgages. And I've never been a big fan of them, although I'm not at that age yet where I've really had to evaluate them closely. But there's a couple concerns I have with reverse mortgages. One is the fees that are associated with them. And the other one is not unlike an annuity, but it's, you're losing some control over a significant asset. And, you get certainty from it, just like you do an annuity. But that certainty comes at a cost. And but I mention it because it is an option out there. And as I've said, circumstances are very individual, specific to each of our individual circumstances, and so it may be an option that you want to consider, and that's why I raised it with John. But again, I don't believe Fidelity sells reverse mortgages, so I wanted to make that clear. So that brings the podcast to a close for this week. You can get the show notes, as always, at DoughRoller.net/podcast5. And there you'll find links to all of the various resources that John mentioned. So with that brings our podcast to a close. As always, you can reach me at dr@DoughRoller.net. I answer every single email I receive. Happy to take your comments and questions. You can subscribe to this podcast and leave a review at the iTunes page, which you can find easily if you just go to DoughRoller.net/iTunes. That'll direct you to the iTunes page. And lastly, if you're not a subscriber to the DoughRoller newsletter, I encourage you to do so. It's a free newsletter I send out every week, Saturday at 8 p.m. You can subscribe at DoughRoller.net/newsletter. So until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.